Hello, my name is Kevin Kamps. I serve as radioactive waste specialist at Beyond Nuclear. We're headquartered in the nuclear-free zone of Tacoma Park, Maryland, USA. I'm thankful for this opportunity to speak briefly today about the hazards of the Japanese government and Tokyo Electric's scheme to dump a vast amount of radioactive wastewater into the Pacific Ocean from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. One of the hazardous substances in the wastewater is radioactive hydrogen, which is called tritium. Unfortunately, tritium is often described by government agencies and by the nuclear power industry as somehow harmless. This is far from the truth. In fact, tritium, which emits a beta particle, is a potent radioactive hazard. The problem is that tritium is so small that it is difficult and perhaps nearly impossible to filter out of a large amount of radioactive wastewater at an industrial scale. For this reason, government agencies and the nuclear industry often try to downplay the hazards of artificial tritium in order to allow the industry to carry out its activities. In the case of the Fukushima Daiichi site, where 3 reactors melted down, there is now a vast quantity of stored tritiated wastewater. There are 1.25 million metric tons of radioactive wastewater, which is 1.25 billion liters of radioactive wastewater. The concentration of artificial tritium in this wastewater is astronomical. There is a trace amount of natural tritium in Earth's surface waters. It's due to cosmic radiation interacting with the Earth's atmosphere, but it's present in only very trace amounts. Tritium's concentration is only 3 to 24 picocuries per liter of natural surface water. But the concentration of hazardous artificial tritium in Fukushima's wastewater is 1 million times that level. In fact, even though Tokyo Electric has passed the wastewater through the advanced liquid processing system twice, in some cases, the tritium concentration in the wastewater is still nearly 14 times higher than Japanese government regulations allow for open ocean dumping. Thus, this decision to dump in the ocean carries tremendous risks. The supposed justification is an attempt to dilute the tritium in the ocean's waters. But what they don't mention is that the tritium will reconcentrate. It will bioconcentrate, bioaccumulate, and biomagnify in seafood. Tritium-contaminated small fish will be eaten by big fish, which will then be eaten by bigger fish. And humans are at the top of this food chain. Humans would be exposed to the most concentrated tritium doses and would be exposed to other hazardous radioactive elements, also present in the wastewater. This bioaccumulation danger was warned about decades ago by Dr. Rosalie Bertell, founder of the International Institute of Concern for Public Health in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. She warned that dilution is not the solution to radioactive pollution. Michael Keegan of the Coalition for a Nuclear-Free Great Lakes refers to this notion of dilution as the solution as a delusion. So this contamination of the seafood supply is of great concern downstream and up the food chain from Fukushima Daiichi. The health hazards of tritium are due to the ability of radioactive hydrogen to go anywhere in the human body that hydrogen can go, which is everywhere in the human body. It can integrate at the most intimate levels of our anatomy, at the molecular, cellular, tissue, and organ levels. Once there, it can deliver its potent beta particle emission at very close range to vulnerable and vital biomolecules, cells, tissues, and organs, and inflict tremendous damage. This can later manifest as cancer, birth defects, genetic damage, or reproductive system harm. This is why this radioactive wastewater should not be dumped into the Pacific Ocean. I'm from Michigan, the Great Lakes state. Unfortunately, the environmental, anti-nuclear, and environmental justice movements in the Great Lakes region have to do battle with both the American and Canadian nuclear power industries. American reactors, like those of the very same design as at Fukushima Daiichi, General Electric boiling water reactors, as well as the pressurized water reactors in the United States, all release tritium during routine operations. Tritium is released to the air, from which it can fall out onto the Great Lakes. Tritiated wastewater is also regularly discharged into the Great Lakes. All this despite its documented hazards. This tritium pollution of the Great Lakes is a real concern, especially that coming from Canadian reactors. Due to their design, CANDU reactors are even worse than American reactors in terms of the amount of tritium that they generate and release to the environment per unit of electricity generated. The contamination of the Great Lakes fisheries is of deep concern, but so too the contamination of the drinking and irrigation water supply. The Great Lakes are 21% of the world's surface fresh water and 84% of North America's surface fresh water. The Great Lakes provide drinking water for 40 million people in 8 US states, 2 Canadian provinces, and a very large number of Native American First Nations. Agricultural products grown with Great Lakes irrigation water are also consumed by countless millions. That figure, 40 million people who drink Great Lakes water, is just for current generations. But what about future generations? Safe, clean drinking and irrigation water is becoming even more precious and vital on this troubled planet of ours. As Lakota and Ojibwe Native American water protectors say, water is life. For these reasons, and many others, we are trying to stop tritium releases into the Great Lakes. Certainly, this massive proposed release, to be done on purpose, of radioactive tritium from Fukushima Daiichi into the Pacific Ocean is outrageous and unacceptable, and it must be stopped. What are some alternative solutions then? Well, it's been suggested from the earliest weeks of the Fukushima nuclear catastrophe by the likes of Dr. Arjun Makhijani, president of the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research, that the tritium in the wastewater should simply be stored as safely and securely as possible for as long as it remains hazardous. Tritium has a half-life of 12.3 years. Its hazardous persistence is 10 to 20 half-lives, so about 125 to 250 years. The hazardous tritium that is present in such vast quantities in the Fukushima wastewater should be stored as safely and securely as possible for that amount of time. This would allow tritium's radioactivity to decay away until it is no longer hazardous. Some Japanese civil society advocates have suggested that instead of the large number of relatively small-sized radioactive wastewater containers used at the Fukushima site right now, that much larger containers be used. Such containers, like those used in the petrochemical industry for many decades now, should be deployed, safeguarded, and secured at the site. There are very poor reasons being given for why this dumping into the Pacific Ocean supposedly must take place. These reasons are not true nor legitimate. Certain Pacific Rim neighboring governments have loudly protested this dumping plan. The South Korean, Chinese, Taiwanese, and Russian governments have spoken out against Fukushima's radioactive wastewater dumping scheme. This is because their own respective domestic populations also depend upon the Pacific Ocean, including for a healthy seafood supply. I should point out that the Pacific's currents have already carried Fukushima's radioactive contamination all the way across the ocean to the western coastline of North America. Airborne radioactive fallout took just days to arrive and began to pollute places all across the North American continent, as by falling in rainfall. Waterborne contamination in the ocean took just months to arrive in the form of contamination in the flesh of migrating bluefin tuna. It may have taken a few years, but the main plume of radioactive contamination from Fukushima Daiichi in the Pacific did arrive on North America's west coast via ocean currents. It effectively doubled the previous concentration of radioactive cesium from bomb test fallout, present in open ocean waters arriving at the central California coast. The radioactive wastewater that Tokyo Electric and the Japanese government are now scheming to dump into the Pacific Ocean will likewise reach the United States and Canada over time. The Biden administration's support for Tokyo Electric and the Japanese government's scheme is objectionable. It is also outrageous that American advisors to Tokyo Electric, such as the former chairman of the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Dale Klein, and the former acting director of the US Department of Energy's Yucca Mountain radioactive waste dump project, Lake Barrett, have spoken in favor of the ocean dumping scheme. Beyond Nuclear has been honored and privileged to join with the international anti-nuclear, environmental, ocean protection, and environmental justice movements. It's been an honor to have worked together with them for years to protest this plan. Hundreds of organizations and countless thousands of individuals have signed on to multiple coalition statements and petitions for years now, including again recently. These statements and petitions have urgently called on the Japanese government and Tokyo Electric to not do this and to instead implement a better storage method to protect the Pacific Ocean, which is so precious and vital to all of humankind and other living beings. Thank you for this opportunity.